A lot of companies get in trouble because they collect data for one purpose and then it ends up getting used for something else. And that, to me, is indicative of a governance problem. The two privacy problems really data collection and data retention. Why are you collecting it? Why do you need it? How long do you need it? That's where you get into privacy, and that's where you get into some of those cyber risks.
Welcome to the Peak IDV Executive Series video podcast, where I speak with executives, leaders, founders, and change makers in the digital identity space. I'm your host, Steve Craig, founder and chief enablement officer at Peak IDV. For our audience, this is a video first series. So if you're enjoying the audio version, please check out the video recording on executiveseries.peakidv.com, where you can watch the full episode, read the transcript, and access any of the resources or links from today's conversation. This is the premiere episode of season 3, and I'm thrilled to kick off this new season with Debbie Reynolds, the Data Diva. Debbie is founder, chief executive officer, and chief data privacy officer of Debbie Reynolds Consulting, LLC. She is a world-renowned technologist, thought leader, and advisor working at the intersection of data privacy, technology, and law. Debbie is also a top consulting voice on LinkedIn, is an internationally published author, highly sought speaker, and top media presence on global data privacy, data protection, and emerging technology issues and matters. Debbie's podcast, The Data Diva Talks Privacy, is the #1 data privacy podcast worldwide. Welcome, Debbie. I'm beyond thrilled for you to be on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Steve, for having me on the show. I really enjoy your show, so I'm happy to be a guest here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, let's get started. Can you share more about your consulting practice and your business? Like, what's your elevator pitch?
Oh, that's a good question. I think my elevator pitch is I like to help companies overcome things like barriers to adoption as it relates to privacy and emerging technology. So companies they get excited about emerging technology. They want to see how they can implement it. So I work with them either on the implementation side or the advisory side as in terms of how they navigate some of the privacy global landscape. And then the other side of my business, I do like you have a podcast, I have a production company. So we do, videos, podcasts, different things for companies. So very exciting. And I'm a speaker as well.
Excellent. Excellent. And I love how you include in your title, Chief Data Privacy Officer. In part, I call myself Chief Enablement Officer because I'm enabling people to be experts in IDV. But what are some of the key responsibilities of the CDPO? Like, should companies have this role?
Yeah. So I thought because I am the CEO of my own company, people and my company has my own name. When you say CEO, it doesn't really tell you what you do. So that's why I have the title of Chief Data Privacy Officer. So basically, what I do is help companies with maturity in terms of data privacy. So I do that for my company. I do that for other companies. So, not all companies are at the same place or not all companies have the same risk appetite, I would say, around privacy. So I try to meet people where they are, see where they want to go and see where we can move them to in terms of maturity. So it's sort of like, I've heard someone say like if a shark stops swimming, it dies, right? Because it'll just sink to the bottom of the ocean. So you have to keep swimming. Privacy is not a one and done thing. It's not like it's a sprint where you get to the end and whoo, I've solved privacy and I'm so cool and I don't have to do anything else. It's just not that way. So it is a progression. It's something that has to happen, has to be part of the lifeblood of an organization, and it has to be very fundamental now to how companies handle data, and it's an ongoing process.
Are you seeing more and more companies have it as a designated role within an organization where someone's responsible specifically for that?
We are. I am seeing that a lot more. So whether it be people internal, obviously, really big companies, they have a whole staff, like many people who work on that. Whether it be sometimes it's divided between like the legal part of privacy and the technology part. I sort of play in that middle space. And then, some companies, not all companies need a data privacy officer, but some companies decide they do want someone fractional. So they may not need someone full time, but they want to have a relationship with someone who knows enough about, what they're doing. And then there are some, a lot of companies, they try to give it as a role, maybe a responsibility to someone who's existing. And I think, even though I don't think that's a bad thing, I think that if companies want to do that, they need to really invest in that person and make sure that they have the proper resources and training. So I don't recommend what I've seen other people say, "Hey, John, down the hall, you like technology, you're the data privacy officer." They don't give him any tasks to do, they don't give them any funding, no training. And so they're on a lot, in certain jurisdictions, it could get as serious as like in Asia. You can have criminal charges against the person if they mishandle data. On the other side of that spectrum, let's say in Europe or whatever, a person can be sanctioned if they don't handle data properly. So be a serious thing depending on jurisdiction. But I am not the person to say, "Oh, you always have to have a full time person, or you always have to have like, you can't have someone internal." That's not true, right? So there are a lot of people who can come into this role to do it. You do need to have someone who has aptitude to learn, know that it's an ongoing process, and you're constantly reading and learning, basically.
Yeah, and looking at your background, I see your career has predominantly been in the legal field. Can you share with me your journey when you got more involved in the data privacy components of
Yeah.
legal side and compliance?
Sure. So my background is in technology. So that's my trajectory. So you are probably too young, Steve, to remember when people had card catalogs and libraries, but I was turning those into databases back in the day.
Okay.
And so that's really how my technology journey started. Then I started getting
The Dewey
contacted.
Decimal System,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
that style, or
Yeah.
that's a
Well,
little bit
yeah.
of
So
not that young.
but yeah, so I started creating databases for companies. And so some of those companies were involved in legal matters and things like that. But I'd always had this digital transformation thread through my career. And so I've done it for a lot of different companies and different industries, not just legal, but a lot of legal people. I know a lot of legal people because a lot of times they were involved in litigation and they needed data, right? And it's okay, I need data, I need it fast, I need it from here. And I'm like, oh, well, this is how you do that. This is how you move that data here or there. So I actually, because I had done that for so long, I started to get calls from companies that I worked with that knew me. And around the time in Europe when they started to decide in the mid 2000s that they were going to update their data director, I started getting calls from people who knew me from all those digital transformation things. And they were like, "Hey, we know you know about this privacy stuff. So come talk to us." So probably one of the first big companies that asked me to come speak with them was McDonald's Corporation. So I spoke with their corporate legal department. This is before the general data protection regulation came out, and they were like, "Hey, what do we need to be thinking about?" Or stuff like that. I talked to their entire legal department, and that was a long time ago. So as I said, it was before GDPR came out, and then as I started talking more about privacy, and I actually have a personal interest in privacy, and I knew that as technology, all this digital transformation was bringing in a lot of privacy risks. So, it gave me opportunity to focus there. So I've been really excited to do that. But a few years later, when GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, went into effect, PBS called me and asked me to be on TV, to talk about it. So people still ask me about that interview. So yeah.
Was that your first media interview
No,
for the PBS?
I've been interviewed
Oh,
a
that's
lot, like in the press, the New York Times on my text, so I've for many years I've been interviewed by media outlets and different things like that. But I think up to that time, no one really cared a lot about privacy, right? So that was the first time people, it wasn't entangled with some other thing, right? So I think that was a big deal.
well, at what point did you decide that you wanted to go independent and start your consultancy? It looked like on LinkedIn it was 2019, but had you been consulting prior to that?
Yeah, I'd always done had I actually my first job out of college, I had my own business, doing consulting. So I've always done consulting in, again, digital transformation and a lot of different things. So ad tech, the techs, ad tech, fintech, whatever. People knew that I knew how to do these things. So I like help them with certain different projects. So to me, it all comes together because the center uh, thread through my career is data, right? And so for me, I can go in any direction. So it doesn't matter to me. Like people ask me, oh, what type of clients do you have? I have Fortune 50 companies, like small companies. It really depends on not the size of the company, but the seriousness of their data problem. So
Yeah.
so yeah, the more serious the data problem, the more serious they want someone more who understands those high risks, basically.
Yeah. Does it tend to be more B to B to C versus B to C? Like what sort of companies end up having the most issues?
Yeah, a lot of I work a lot with definitely B2B, but also companies that have B2C issues, right? So I'm working directly with the company. Maybe they have, you know, millions of customers and they want to, do X, whatever X is, and they want some help there. Or companies, maybe they are trying to do contracts between two different businesses, right? They want to collaborate in some way. They want to get through some of these privacy challenges. So yeah.
What are some of the common struggles that are brought to you in terms of like the challenges and what they need most pressing help with?
Some of the common struggles, I get a lot of calls from people who, as I said before, barriers to adoption, right? So barriers to adoption can be, let's say a company has a cool product, they want to sign a contract with a big company, and the company says, hey, we want to see your privacy program. And they're like, oh, we don't have one, right? So then they have to go back to the drawing board. Or company, let's say a company is in a different wants to move into a new area, maybe that they've never been in before, right? They have some emerging technology component. So, for example, I had a client. They're famous for being in the cable TV business, right? And they wanted to move into smart cities. Um, so that meant that okay, now it's not just their B2C customers. Now it's like, okay, now I'm putting technology into vehicles. I'm putting technology into the traffic lights. I'm doing, all these different things that mean that they're handling data in different ways. So a lot of times I get involved with them, like with developer groups a lot. So I'm typically advising them before it even gets to legal, because I tell people privacy is a data problem that has legal implications. It's not a legal problem that has data implications. So unfortunately, some people they take it from the legal side, but really the problem is the data, right? So if companies have a better way to govern their data, understand what data they have, why they have it, why they're using it, when to get rid of it. So that data life cycle is really huge deal, and it's a big problem for companies because up up until the time that a lot of these data privacy regulations came about, a lot of companies didn't have a reason to delete data, right? And a lot of these regulations are saying, "Hey, only keep data until your purpose has extinguished." And so before it was like, "Let's keep it forever. Let's do whatever we want to with it. Let's use it for other stuff." And that's what a lot of these regulations are trying to guard against because they don't want people to do that because they know there's a lot of harm that can happen as a result.
Yeah, yeah. I felt like in the 2000s and the 2010s, it was all about big data. Collect as much data as you could because the data was now the new oil. And it was like, okay, we don't know what we're going to do with it all, but let's just collect as much of it because someday we might be able to monetize. That's interesting how that transition has occurred. With Peak IDV and the audience that watches this podcast, it's typically providers and practitioners of digital identity or identity verification technologies. Sometimes data privacy is and like the IDV practices can be at odds with each other because you want to know someone. So you want to ask them as much as you can about them and get driver's licenses and selfies and ask all these questions. But then you need to balance that. And I think consumers have awoken to some of the challenges with over collection. How have you seen that area of the world, like that transformation, digital identity, uh, be affected by some of the privacy policies that are happening?
Yeah, identity is a fascinating space. I have a lot of friends in identity, especially in banking and fintech and biometrics. So I think, some of the growing pains that we're seeing in the democratization of AI, I think has probably already happened a lot in identity, where it's like, how much data should we collect? Should we have an empty database or should we have a full database? Like, how much data do we need to collect to be able to do this process? So I think, those challenges are always there. I think what people don't really realize that when they move into a situation where they're using biometrics, for example, let's say, give you an example. Let's say, for instance, a company, have been accustomed, they're a drugstore. So they're being accustomed to using just a regular video camera in the store, right? To make sure people are stealing or just, checking out everything. And then they decide they want to use a biometric camera that actually has a database attached to it and they're doing facial recognition, right? So that's not a like for like exchange, right? So maybe the camera looks the same, but the technology is doing something different and that raises those privacy risks. So it really is incumbent upon not just the people who create these technologies, but the people who use it to understand what they need to do, right? Because a lot of the problems that companies have around identity is a lot of times the over collection of data. Really, the two privacy problems really is only two: data collection and data retention, right? So the data you collect, why are you collecting it? Why do you need it? Whatever. How long do you need it? So that's where you get into privacy and that's where you get into some of those cyber risks for companies. So being able to really, like you said, do that balancing act is really important and not just sort of close your eyes and think that, oh, the tool works perfectly and we don't have to do anything. So it's, with great power comes a great responsibility. So I think people need to understand that when they implement these tools, it's not like an easy button, and they need to there has to be some human judgment and some governance in terms of how the data is handled.
Totally. Now, we don't have to name names, but I think I might have read a similar article about the company that was using some of those technologies, and they were told that they can't. Like they got put in a penalty box that they're no longer able to do that for a few years. And the risks of abuse beyond the reputational damage or potential for fraud from that, but just making poor decisions by not having the right use of that technology are considerably high right now as people are diving in. We're recording this at the start of 2024. What are some of the topics that practitioners or solution providers should really have on their radar as they think about their next big project or their go to market? Anything that comes to mind, so you don't end up like that company, get in trouble?
Well, it goes back to me with data collection and that data retention, again, and what you're gonna do with that data. That's a problem. So but the particular case you're talking about is in the public domain, so I can talk about it, is Rite Aid, and so Rite Aid they were banned for 5 years. So they can't use facial recognition in any of their stores for 5 years because they put on the naughty list. I guess they had a run-in previously, many, many years ago, about some bad governance around data, like collecting data, uh, having false matches to people's faces on databases, going out to social media, trying to match people's face with social media of people in the store, harassing customers because they thought they looked like people, calling the police on. I mean, it was just buck wild, right? So this is like it's like falling from a tree and hitting like every branch on the way down. So I think this is the reason why the FTC highlighted this case because of probably almost anything that could have gone wrong in that scenario did go wrong. But on the flip side, I see a lot of companies, they do a very good job of managing the governance risks that have to do with biometrics. So like making sure that people they have the rights, making sure people are aware of what is happening. Like if they're recording, if they're using facial recognition, making sure that people can opt out if that's uh, uh, a opportunity to do that, making sure that they're not, falsely accusing people. You have to be sure you're sure. That was Stevie Wonder's song. Before you try to accost people or try to arrest them and different things like that. So really what the regulators want is people who are using these types of technology in what they call a high risk use case. So anything that could possibly harm the life or liberty of someone is one the regulators really, really look at. The people who do these technologies the best to me, you know, they say, okay, I'm gonna collect this data. Maybe you want to match your face. You go to an airport, and then once we do that, then we delete the data. That's like the best you can hope for, right? Because beyond that, what's needed for, right? So I think companies really need to ask themselves that question all the way through the process. So data has a life cycle, like cradle to grave. So you can't think about a lot of times companies they get excited about the cradle part and they don't think about the end of life strategy for that data. So has to be an end of life, can't be an open-ended situation, especially when you're thinking about identity and biometrics.
Yeah, it feels like the company should be thinking about each angle and playing it ahead on how that data could be used and then what could go wrong in that scenario. One that came to mind as you were speaking was what happened with Zoom when Zoom, the web conferencing system, changed their terms and conditions about something with how they were going to use the data. And there was tremendous uproar around that because they weren't thinking through like how that would be perceived by the public and what privacy laws that would break or any challenges with that. So I find that to be fascinating, that thought work. It's almost like you have to have a crystal ball, at least think about it first before you make those big changes.
Yeah. A lot of companies get in trouble because they collect data for one purpose and then it ends up getting used for something else. And that to me is indicative of a governance problem within an organization. So another public thing we talk about is Twitter. So Twitter had a problem where they were asking users to give them their email address and their phone number, and the purpose was that they were wanted to use it for multi-factor authentication, and that's fine, no problem, right? But then the marketing people got that data and they started using it to market to people. It's like, okay, that's no, no, no. That's a problem, right? And so that's a governance problem. So if the data was collected for one purpose, it shouldn't be used for another purpose without you uh, getting permission from that person, right? Because basically you're saying, hey, let me pretend like I want it for this one purpose and use it for another one, right? And it may not be nefarious because what happens a lot of times in organizations, data comes in and then the how it got there gets lost, right? So that lineage is not there. And so someone says, "Hey, I found a bucket of data. Let's use it for this." Okay, whatever. And so these laws and regulations, what they're trying to do is bring more transparency to that data lifecycle. And they're trying to make sure that the companies know that there's a governance step there. So just because it's in your possession doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want with that data. Those days are gone.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think by now people realize, okay, I can't sell customers' data, I can't use it for marketing purposes. Well, one of the things we've seen a lot of in this last year is, well, hey, I've got this data. What can I train in artificial intelligence? And I know you do a lot of thought leadership in that. And I was watching a session you did with the Next Curve webcast on personalization and privacy and all that's going on with generative AI. Feels like companies are really wanting to jump on that large language model train and start to do stuff with the data they sit on. Well, what should companies or individuals think about when it comes to privacy and data risks for
Yeah.
that plan?
Make sure, first of all, people are think of generative AI and generative AI tools as like a Swiss Army knife. So it can do many different things. So a lot of times when I hear people talk about it, they they think about it in terms of it doing one thing, right? And it's just not that way. But the thing that companies need to think about is that data provenance and data lineage. So provenance is, do I have a right to have this data in the first place? That's your first question, right? Then now the legal people are really concerned about that provenance. But then you can go off the rails with lineage. So, and go back to the Twitter example. So they had the provenance of the data when they requested it for multi-factor authentication. The people consented to it, right? Gave them the data. So that's provenance, right? So you have a legal right to have it. People say it's okay. Then you take the data, somehow it gets to marketing, which, the person didn't agree to, and you start using it for that. And that's data lineage. So when you're thinking about AI systems, you have to track the data all the way through the process. So do we have a legal right to have the data is one question. And then as it's going through the process, you can succeed at provenance and fail at lineage and fail completely. Right. So don't get so excited about the provenance part because you can mess up. A lot of people, the mess up is not the provenance, really. It's really that lineage that happens. So with right now with OpenAI, they're having a double whammy. So they're having lineage and provenance legal issues going on. So I think it'll be interesting to see how all that will play out. But these are powerful tools. I think they'll evolve a lot, very rapidly, change very rapidly. Right now, we're talking a lot about large language models. I think the a future will be little language models where things will be more purpose built. They won't need as many parameters. They won't need, as many documents in these databases. Like, what do you or I need with like a million cat videos in the database? I don't need that, right? Someone created that. That's their own IP. That's their own copyright. I don't need that, right? But maybe what I want is the tool so that I can do what I want to do with it. So I think that's going to be the future of LLMs in the future.
That's great. I can envision a not too distant future when these models are really securely on the device
Yeah.
and that data doesn't go anywhere. I can see Apple being a leader in that area as they develop some of those systems.
Yeah.
Another area that is expanding and changing when we think about transformation is this convergence of the physical and the digital world, and that can include your identity, but just how you interact in spaces, and then in the digital world. You dropped in on one of the Peak IDV live events where we talked about that convergence. Thanks for joining. We didn't get to go in too deep to some of the topics I think are really relevant, and one of them was IoT, the Internet of Things. I was looking at your profile. I see you're in the advisory board for the U.S. Department of Commerce's initiatives around this area. What are some of the things that we should think about when it comes to IoT and privacy and personal identity and how that all relates as that really expands?
Yeah. I decided that that was an area that I want to focus in emerging technologies because I think that that is one of, first of all, in terms of technology, hardware, that is one of the most ubiquitous types of interactions that humans have with technology, in my view, which is hardware, right? So these are smart speakers, they are your TVs, or, all those things. So I call an IoT device a computer without a screen, right? So when you have a speaker in your house, it looks innocuous, like, oh, it's not doing anything. It's just, it doesn't have any buttons on it. It doesn't have a screen. You don't really know what it's doing. But what you don't understand is that, when first of all, it's connected to the internet, then it's being updated, right? So maybe the thing that you brought, a year ago, now it has functionality that it didn't have a year ago. Now it's doing things that it wasn't doing a year ago. So how do you know that as a consumer? What do you need to know about, how it's collecting your data? Can you opt out of certain things? So that's the concern that I have around IoT. And so I think as people, like you said, how, we have the metaverse, right? Even though, you know, that was a hot word, it hasn't gone away under any circumstances, right? That's still there, but it's going to have probably more real world uses, not these crazy, uh, out of this world use cases, I think. But, how you move in spaces, how, there's going to be situations, there's technology where sensors can be like the size of a postage stamp, and they can be put anywhere. And all they really need is a device that knows how to read that information. Like, what does that mean for the person that's moving through these spaces, and how their data is being collected? So all of it is about collection and retention. So let's say let's say you have a space someone's moving in, it has all these sensors or whatever, and maybe the data is only needed for the time when that person is in that space. And if the company decided, okay, we don't need this data, we just need it for them while they're in the experience, and then we delete it. That's great. That's to me, that's like the best you could possibly ask for. 'Cause it gets you out of legal trouble. It gets you out of the problem with the person, right? So they understand how this data, we're collecting your data right now as you move through the space, but once you're out of the space, we're gonna delete the data, right? So no privacy problems there, no consumer problems because it's more, evident, more transparent. So that's where we need to go. Right now, we have organizations, unfortunately, they're not doing that communication. They're not being transparent because corporations have traditionally always kept everything. That's just the mold. Deleting stuff is like swimming upstream within a corporation and even databases. So databases are made to remember, not forget stuff. So when we say, okay, you need to delete stuff, they're like, what? Delete? You're like, it becomes like a huge big deal, a huge big project because a lot of these technologies were never made to do that.
Yeah, yeah, and these days, almost everything you buy that even if it doesn't have a screen, has a computer in it, and it's probably an internet connected computer. Uh, the appliances, we all pretty familiar with that. You got a refrigerator that connects now to clouds and ovens and this and that, but it's really hard to know if, to your point about the speaker, is it just a speaker? Is it just output? Are there microphones in there? Does it connect to a Wi-Fi? Does it have a cellular chip that you might not know about? Like all these things I think are problematic for consumers. As you were describing this the spaces concept, I was thinking about just going out to the mall or a store. It's like, how do you know what is tracking you? Of course, you've got computer vision and cameras, but as you move about, like you're not signing a release when you walk into the store. How can they collect things on you if you haven't been privy to that? So I think it's a fascinating area. I think investing in IoT is a good play. No, we're coming up on time, and there is a timely topic that I want to bring up. It's just when this was recorded just in the last few weeks, it was getting a lot of press, and that had to do with the DNA company 23andMe. They had a data breach, and there was a lot of data that is not just your personal DNA data, but your relative connections, family members. There was some sort of hack, but then in the end, they said, "Oh no, this wasn't a hack. This was password reuse, and it was our customers that caused the problem." And they did a little bit of a almost like a victim shaming, like, "Oh, if you didn't reuse your passwords." That didn't go over well, and it's still an ongoing topic. But what are some of your recommendations when you think about data privacy and connecting to the identity topic? Well, what are recommendations you have when someone runs into that situation?
Yeah. Well, 23andMe is a very unique situation. It's hard to even, I can't even think of anything that compares in the magnitude of a breach in that regard, right? So your DNA is, it is you, right? It is everything about you. It's about all types of inferences and things like that. And, you know, it was so popular that police agencies around the world want that data, because they wanna say, "Hey, we want this DNA 'cause we think your cousin stole something from the store," or whatever. And a person, I've had family members who've used that, service, and it's, very innocent, right? They wanna know, what is my heritage? Especially you're Black, a Black person, you know? I don't know, where my, unfortunately, my lineage in the same way maybe my boyfriend knows his lineage because he's Jewish or whatever. But, very innocent, right? So when people are signing up for that, they didn't intend for their data to be used in like police databases, and they didn't intend for their data to be not secured in a way that can be breached by someone. There are things in your DNA, maybe you're predisposed to cancer or something. And someone says, "Hey, I'm not gonna hire Steve because he's predisposed to cancer and we don't want to have like high insurance rates or whatever, whether you have cancer or not." So this is the danger of over collecting data, collecting it for not the right purpose, and then protection, right? So if you want to collect data that's of such a sensitive nature, you have to have like the best security ever. Can't just, this is not like, oh, Sally drinks, flat white latte on Tuesday, right? So this is like your heritage, where you're from, what your predisposition is for certain genetic things, whether it's true or not. So you know, I think that the government will make an example out of 23andMe because I think I can't even imagine. I probably the worst breach I was thinking of was probably like credit. But the credit bureau breaches because when someone steals your identity, they may not have to do it right then, so, it may not impact you right now. Maybe it'll impact you in the future. There are people who couldn't get jobs. There are people who were denied housing, just from all types of wackiness with that, right? And that's bad, but I think DNA is the worst because you can't change your DNA. So if it's breached or so it's being misused, you can't do anything about that. So there's really no adequate legal redress for that type of problem. And it's not a victim problem, right? It's the problem of the company collecting the data. So my thing is, if you can't protect it, don't collect it.
It's a good point, and I think about the fallout from trying to address the issue. Okay, the first mistake was, okay, the data got access, but then to put out a statement that says, "Well, not our fault," in a way, companies need to think through the ramifications of how they react to that. Of course, they can also be silent. That's not good either. But I think you're right. The government needs to do more when it comes to making examples. There are a few other DNA database services out there that hopefully are seeing that and really boosting up their security processes and whatnot. To close out today's session, I really want to highlight two of your media properties from the media side of your business that are really inspiring to me because I'm leveraging similar tools and capabilities. The first one is your LinkedIn newsletter, the Data Privacy Advantage. You've got over 11,000 subscribers on that. That's tremendous. Can you share more about the topics you cover and if there's any particular topics that resonate with your LinkedIn audience?
Oh, aren't you sweet? Thank you. Thank you. I really love the newsletter. I had struggled for years to decide whether I wanted to do a newsletter or not. And I thought I did because sometimes you can't really express things in a soundbite, right? So you don't get a lot of time or attention for people. And sometimes you need to be able to have a outlet where you can explain things. You can read them and then go back and like ruminate on them. So that's really the impetus behind the newsletter. So I always try to think about what is the higher vision that I want to share that you can't do in a 5-minute video or maybe doesn't come across in a podcast or things like that. So that's really what I do. So I try to think about like, what's happening right now? What is it that people need to know that they can use now that will probably help them in the future? So, it's not, I don't do hot takes. I don't do, oh, this happened, a dog bit me yesterday. Like that's not what I try to do the newsletter. I try to say, what can I share with someone that they can take right now and use? And so that's what I try to do in the newsletter. Everybody asks me about AI. So uh,
Is that
AI and
and the more
privacy.
uh, AI and private, or those are the main topics that seem to get a lot of engagement, um, reactions when you
Yes.
post those?
Yeah. So I do a lot of speaking. So I've done quite a bit of speaking in the last 12 months to, tiny companies like PayPal and Coca-Cola and Johnson& and Johnson about AI and privacy. It's a hot, hot
Just
time.
small
Yeah.
little
Yeah.
company. It's the biggest brands in the
Yeah.
world.
Uber.
That's about well, the newsletter is really impressive. I think the newsletter format from LinkedIn is great because it does go into people's inboxes versus when you're just posting on LinkedIn, the algorithm decides and maybe you get a lot of engagement. You don't, but with the newsletter, gets out there. But the second property I want to highlight, which I mentioned in the intro, is your podcast. It's the number one data privacy podcast in the world. I saw your post around December, the holidays, 100,000 downloads. over 160 episodes. I would call that a phenomenon, right? Can you share the origin story of how you decided, hey, I'm going to do a podcast? Because I've got one for myself, but I'm not at 160 episodes and 100,000 downloads. So I'm curious about
Yeah. I fought myself for a while about a podcast. I thought I wanted it. I didn't know. You see a lot of people out on LinkedIn or in different areas and they're talking about things. And I felt like, I was like screaming at the computer, right? Because I'm like, why are people talking about this, right? So the thing that I want to make sure that my podcast does always, and so this is like the origin of reason why I do it, is I talk about the things that people aren't talking about. So people describe it as the narrows. So I go into those deep issues that a lot of people maybe don't want to touch, they don't want to talk about, they don't want to talk about, so I'm talking about um, you know, digital transformation, not just digital transformation, digital degradation, end of life, data retention, bias, equity, all types of stuff. So these are all human issues and they're hard. They're really, really hard. So I'm always attracted to really complex problems. So I steer towards those more complex issues. And I try to make sure that I'm illuminating them in a way that you can't really do in a soundbite. So yeah.
That's great. Well, I'll definitely include a link directly to your newsletter as well as the podcast. So those that are watching this will see it. But chances are, with 100,000 plus downloads and number of episodes, you're already on their radar. We're just out about at time, Debbie. If you've seen a few of these episodes, I like to go beyond the LinkedIn profile, beyond the business side. Are there any passions or personal causes outside of data privacy and the things we've discussed that are important to you that you could share?
It's a great question. Privacy is not just my job. I am passionate about that, right? So I'm passionate about human rights, I guess. I guess that's what way I could talk about it, right? It's a part of a human right. And for me, that's what I want in the US. So I want privacy to be a human right in the Constitution, which it is not now. So there are other places that where they have privacy as a fundamental human right in their constitution, including the EU and India 2 years ago added that. So I think that's to me that's like a proper foundation that we can have in the US to be able to create regulation that actually helps people and not hurt them.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost as if we need a constitutional amendment around there, be able to affect that. But then at the same time, it can be tough with the way the government likes to track or the Internal Revenue Service. Like sometimes they push the boundaries of that as well. Well, as we wrap up, what kind of conversations would you be looking to have from the audience? Anyone who's watched this or listened to it, what are you interested in as far as engagement in the market?
Yeah, well, I'm always open. I love identity. I love that space, that area. So anything in, biometrics, anything AI, all that stuff really interests me. All the little wacky things people are trying to do. For me, I'm always like, oh, well, what is the privacy implication of that? So I'm a technologist by trade. So I love technology. I don't necessarily love everything people try to do with technology. But I'm always interested to see or have conversations with people who are thinking about, what can we do? How can I help? What we can do to, obviously companies, they want to make money, which is fine, right? But you want to do that in a way that doesn't harm people. That's that goal.
Are there any upcoming events that you'll be at? Any keynotes that you have already scheduled or planned for 2024?
I have some things brewing. I can't really discuss about those yet. I try not to telegraph my push. But yeah, I will make sure I share it once everything is set in stone. But there'll be some surprising things that people probably wouldn't expect that are coming up in 2024. But they'll be fun, interesting things.
Very cool, very cool. And if anyone wants to reach out, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah.
Is it LinkedIn or website?
LinkedIn is great. So you can contact me. If you type in Data Diva, Debbie Reynolds, my name will pop up. Or you can look at my website, DebbieReynoldsConsulting.com, and I have all my resources and videos and newsletters on my website.
Excellent. Well, Debbie, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and to be a part of this premiere episode for season 3. I look forward to seeing those announcements that you're going to post and then potentially collaborating with you in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thank you so much.